Everyone, it's your boy here, Matt. So I'm making a video response to one of Russell Barkley's weekly research reviews for the ADHD literature. Russell Barkley is a very accomplished senior psychiatrist who's done a large amount of work studying attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I like his work because I've worked a reasonable amount with people with what are characterized as neurodevelopmental disorders. I hate that term. I prefer the term in neurodivergence because this wide umbrella term, it refers to things such as autism, ADHD, and people who have a lower IQ, and that's just not useful. For example, you know, having autism is quite useful for a lot of jobs. It's not a disorder, it's very adaptive. ADHD, well, if I'm honest, it's usually more of a hindrance than a benefit. But I found that ADHD allows me to see something from multiple different angles because I have to. Well, I don't just have to. By nature of how my mind works, I tend to think of the same problem over and over again, but just in a slightly different way, as a result of this interruption in attention. So in my mind, it's calling it a disorder is a little bit nasty. It just seems like being mean to people, really. There are certainly a lot of different measures which indicate that people who are autistic or have ADHD tend to have a bit of a hard time, and that's something myself and Russell would absolutely agree on. So if you have an interest in ADHD, I recommend, or have ADHD, I highly recommend subscribing to his channel. It's more catered towards people who are either treaters or people who are engaged in research. And if I was ever to lead in a field, I think doing what Russell does, where he looks at the literature, what's come out, and he notes what's more important, is just an excellent way of directing researchers and people coming up in the field of what's going on. So today I am piggybacking off his weekly research review with the purpose of being able to try and communicate to the public some of the struggles that people engaged in research have, remembering that I have a very limited research background, but all junior psychs in Australia, remembering that I'm still waiting on my registration to be renewed, uh, they tend to they almost all have done some form of academic research project, and the intention of that is so that they're able to understand the scientific literature and be able to collaborate if they wish, but more often just interpret uh, scientific research. And I am trying to provide some insights today in what goes wrong in a research study, and how we can't just read a headline about an academic article and from that, or the summary of findings, and from that go, okay, the scientists found that the length of an umbilical cord will tell you if a child's going to have ADHD or not, because it's not like that. Right, so just give me a moment, I'll be right back. Okay, Matt's back. Um, so one of the studies that Russell Barkley talked about was a study regarding the measurement of an umbilical cord. So the cord which goes from the baby to the mother, where nutrients goes through, as being having longer length, in accordance to this study, was a predictive factor of a diagnosis of ADHD. I haven't read the article. I am not critiquing the article. My point is to piggyback off his work to be able to describe how that piece of information can be interpreted. Something like that, there might be what's called a confounding variable. This is a variable which is not intended to be measured, but fundamentally alters the results. So if we're looking at a study, and that study seems to be what's called a quasi-experiment. So this is where and this is just going off from what I've heard from his video. I haven't read the article, and I'm not going to. I'm not currently part of a university, so it's very difficult to get access to academic articles if you do not have a university library membership. It's likely a quasi-experiment. So that's where there's something which has happened in the environment where the variables aren't controlled, but there's enough things that we can measure after the fact that we can try and infer a dependent and independent variable. So a variable which, when is interfered with, and it's just happened that this is interfered with in nature, will change something else. If there isn't some form of action like that happening, it's very difficult to measure anything. So the independent variable in this case was the length of the umbilical cord, and the dependent variable was the diagnosis of ADHD. But what if the case was is that there's different practices for cutting umbilical cords at different hospitals? So, and maybe they have different measurement protocols for that umbilical cord. So in which case it would be, okay, it's actually the hospital that you're born in is what's being measured, and the practices for cutting the umbilical cord at that hospital. And there might be other things at play. So maybe it's where those doctors got their training. So maybe you're measuring the location where the doctor got their training rather than the length of the umbilical cord. And if that's the case, well, why are there more of these doctors in this place where there are more people being diagnosed with ADHD? Well, that might be because this place is lower income area, and there are more people with lower income who have ADHD. That's I'm not entirely sure if that is the case. It tends to be the case that lower income tends to be a predictive factor for all kinds of unpleasant things. But at the same time, there's another thing that I can slide off that from. In another study, he discussed how the prescription of amphetamines, like for ADHD, such as Adderall, stimulants, psychostimulants, was something which was also correlated with having dual diagnosis for mental health problems later in life, such as depression or psychosis, all those things. That doesn't really well, what else could be measured there? What could be measured is access to the psychiatrist and the proclivity for that psychiatrist to diagnose things. So if you are seeing a psychiatrist, it means that there's always going to be a person who you can talk to about different diagnoses, and over time and different concerns. So there's more opportunities for that person to be diagnosed. So in that case, you're measuring the frequency that a person is seeing the psychiatrist and their availability to get a diagnosis of something. So it may be that all the other people in that study were just underrepresented with their diagnoses. Now, that's just a quick glimpse, some quick reflections on his articles, on his weekly review. It certainly isn't a criticism of any of the articles, right? I haven't read them, and I'm not going to. The reason why I'm making this video is just to point out to the public, you can't just, like, when a scientist says that they have a finding, right, that can mean a whole lot of different things. And it's not until that there's what's usually called a meta-analysis, which happens way down the track, when a whole lot of people have done similar studies around a similar set of phenomenon, that the research community goes, oh, okay, we know for a fact that the length of the umbilical cord predicts the diagnosis of ADHD. All right, and we now have a reason why we think it might be We think it's because there's this gene which is also responsible for ADHD, which is also responsible for the length of the umbilical cord, or something like that. So, in conclusion, you can't. Science does not work on one article. There are 1,000. It needs to. It's one measurement. It's a group, one team's assessment of a situation. Science moves very slowly. It takes a long time to figure things out. And the hope is that due to a lot of different academic protocols, eventually that and academic integrity stuff, when we find something out, we can trust it. But that finding something out in science is not done using one experiment. It's done using a whole heap of different studies using different methodologies. So anyway, have a lovely day.